October 14, 1964. 2 a.m. The smell of gasoline drifts past the stained glass of Abyssinian Baptist. Men with badges and matches stand in the alley, waiting for Harlem to explode in blood. The wind coming off the Hudson River carried the bitter chill of mid-October, but in the narrow, labyrinthine alleyways of Harlem, the air felt unnaturally thick, heavy. It was the kind of suffocating atmospheric weight that preceded a violent storm, though the night sky was entirely clear, pierced only by the sickly, flickering amber glow of the corner street lamps. At 2 a.m., the neighborhood was asleep, wrapped in the quiet, fragile sanctuary of the witching hour. But shadows were moving. Behind the towering, historic stone facade of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, men in dark trench coats worn over standard-issue blue trousers stood in absolute silence. They were not men of the neighborhood. They carried no Bibles. They spoke no prayers. They were officers of the New York Police Department, moving with the jittery, nervous energy of amateur criminals. In their hands, heavy metal jerry-cans sloshed with the unmistakable, toxic scent of kerosene and highly refined gasoline. The chemical smell bled into the crisp autumn air, a silent promise of impending violence. The plan, born in the desperate, smoke-filled back rooms of downtown precincts, was as simple as it was catastrophic. Ignite the spiritual pillars of the community. Burn the sanctuaries to the ground. Frame Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson for the sacrilege. The resulting riot would give the city the ultimate excuse it needed to march a uniformed army up Lenox Avenue, tearing through Bumpy's empire under the guise of restoring public order. It was a calculated act of terror, sanctioned by silver shields, designed to snap the back of the only man who held Harlem together. The lead officer, a man with cold, dead eyes and sweat pooling in the deep creases of his neck, unscrewed the rusted cap of the first can. The harsh metallic scrape was deafening in the silence of the alley. He tipped the nozzle. The clear, lethal liquid began to pool against the ancient brickwork of the church, seeping into the foundation, finding the cracks in the mortar. 7 churches targeted across the grid. 7 simultaneous infernos. 7 nails in Bumpy Johnson's coffin. All they needed was a single match. 10 blocks away, the neon glow of a late-night diner painted the wet asphalt in slow streaks of red and blue. Inside, the world moved at a totally different frequency. The air smelled of burnt coffee, stale tobacco, and the faint metallic tang of the radiator hissing in the corner. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few weary night owls, numbers runners silently counting their meager takes, and the tired waitress leaning heavily against the counter. None of them looked toward the back booth. They knew better. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson sat in the corner, enveloped in the dim, forgiving light. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, the fabric impeccable, the cut conservative but undeniably authoritative. A gray fedora rested on the cracked red vinyl of the seat beside him. His hands, weathered by decades of survival, rested flat and perfectly still on the Formica table. A single cup of black coffee sat before him, untouched, its surface a dark, unblinking eye reflecting the overhead bulb. Bumpy was not just a man. He was an institution. He was the gravity that kept Harlem from spinning off its axis. He did not rule through random violence or the chaotic temper tantrums favored by the Italian syndicates downtown. He ruled through inevitability. He was a master of the chessboard, a man who saw 3 moves ahead and understood that true power was not the ability to inflict pain, but the absolute control over when and where it was applied. He watched the street through the rain-streaked window pane. The rhythm of Harlem was in his blood. He knew its pulse. Tonight, the pulse was irregular. The streets were too quiet. The usual midnight symphony of distant sirens, drunken laughter, and shifting gears was entirely absent. It was a manufactured silence. A vacuum. And Bumpy Johnson knew that in the streets, a vacuum was always followed by an explosion. He took a slow, deliberate drag from his cigarette. The cherry burned bright red, illuminating the deep, stoic lines etched into his face. Lines carved by prison time, brutal turf wars, and the heavy burden of the crown. He exhaled a long, thin stream of gray smoke that drifted lazily toward the stamped tin ceiling. He was waiting. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but the primal instinct that had kept him alive for 58 years was screaming. The bell above the diner door jingled. The sound was sharp, cutting violently through the low hum of the commercial refrigerator. A young man stepped inside. He was breathless, his chest heaving, his oversized overcoat soaked with the damp chill of the night. It was Nat, one of the neighborhood's invisible eyes, a kid who ran messages and watched the blind corners. Nat scanned the room, his eyes wide, terrified. He locked eyes with the man in the back booth. Bumpy did not gesture. He did not wave the boy over. He merely blinked. It was enough. Nat crossed the linoleum floor, his footsteps heavy but quick. He slid into the booth opposite Bumpy. He was trembling, not from the cold outside, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the secret he was carrying. He looked at the untouched coffee, then up at Bumpy's impassive, statuesque face. Bumpy crushed the stub of his cigarette into the glass ashtray with a slow, methodical grinding motion. He leaned forward just a fraction of an inch. The movement was slight, but it commanded the entire room. "Breathe, son," Bumpy said. His voice was gravel and silk, barely louder than a whisper, but it possessed an acoustic weight that demanded absolute attention. "The night ain't going nowhere." Nat swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. "Mr. Johnson, it's downtown. The precinct boys. They ain't doing their rounds." Bumpy remained perfectly still. "What are they doing?" "They're in the alleys," Nat whispered, leaning in closer, terrified the walls themselves were listening to the treason. "Abyssinian, St. Philip's, Salem, for others. I saw them, Mr. Johnson. I saw the metal cans. They're pouring kerosene on the back doors. They're getting ready to burn the churches." The words hung suspended in the space between them. For a lesser man, the news would have triggered a sudden, violent outburst. A lesser man would have slammed his fist on the table, shouted frantic orders, and reached for the cold steel tucked into his waistband. But Bumpy Johnson was not a lesser man. The information processed through his mind with cold, terrifying efficiency. He understood the geometry of the trap instantly. The cops weren't just burning brick and wood. They were burning the very soul of the community. The churches were the sanctuaries, the only places where the people of Harlem felt entirely safe, entirely human. If they burned, the neighborhood would erupt in a blind, agonizing rage. They would tear their own streets apart. And when the smoke cleared, the NYPD would stand before the press cameras, point the finger directly at the Harlem underworld, and declare martial law. They would say Bumpy Johnson lost control, or worse, that he ordered it out of spite. It was a brilliantly evil maneuver, an insult of the highest order. They were using his people's sacred faith as kindling to burn his empire to the ground. Bumpy looked past the terrified boy, staring out the window into the dark abyss of the avenue. The reflection of his own eyes stared back at him. Calm, deadly calm. The rage was there, a deep, subterranean fire, but he locked it away behind a heavy vault of steel discipline. Anger was a liability in this game. Restraint was a weapon. "They want a war," Nat whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "They want us to shoot at them so they can shoot back." "They want a riot," Bumpy corrected quietly, his tone devoid of any panic. "They want a tragedy." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a fresh cigarette. He tapped it once on the table, then placed it between his lips. He struck a match. The sudden flare illuminated his face, casting deep, sharp shadows across his prominent cheekbones. He lit the tobacco, shaking the match out with a singular, graceful flick of his wrist. The scent of sulfur from the tiny match mixed with the stale air of the diner. It was a subtle, fleeting scent, a fraction of what the rogue cops were currently pouring into the foundations of Abyssinian. But to Bumpy it was a clarion call. The state believed they held the absolute monopoly on power. They believed they could orchestrate terror in the shadows and comfortably blame the victims in the light. They had miscalculated terribly. Bumpy leaned back into the worn red vinyl, the leather groaning softly under his weight. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the intricate map of Harlem unfold behind his eyelids. He saw the avenues, the cross streets, the blind spots, the narrow alleys. He knew the exact location of every precinct car, the shift changes, the temperament of the desk sergeants. He saw the 7 targeted churches, majestic and vulnerable, standing like silent sentinels in the dark. The police thought they were successfully infiltrating hostile territory. They didn't realize they were stepping directly into Bumpy Johnson's living room. The sheer audacity of the move offended him more than the physical danger. It was a profound disrespect, not just to him as a leader, but to the grandmothers who scrubbed floors all week just to drop shiny nickels into the Sunday collection plate, to the choir members who sang to keep the daily despair at bay, to the preachers who offered a glimpse of dignity in a city that constantly sought to strip it away. The cops weren't just trying to unseat a kingpin. They were trying to break the spirit of an entire race. He opened his eyes. The terrifying stillness had returned to his gaze. "Who else knows?" Bumpy asked, his voice steady, stripped of all inflection. "Nobody," Nat replied quickly, his eyes darting toward the door. "I came straight to you. I ran the whole way. I swear on my mother, Mr. Johnson. I didn't breathe a word to a single soul on the street." "Good." Bumpy nodded slowly, acknowledging the boy's loyalty. Fear spreads faster than fire. If the street finds out the badges are pouring gas on the altars, we won't need the cops to start the riot. The neighborhood will burn itself down in righteous, unthinking fury. We cannot afford righteous fury tonight. Tonight, we need ice. He picked up the cup of black coffee. It was stone cold. He took a sip anyway, allowing the bitter liquid to ground him in the present moment. He set the cup down precisely where it had been, perfectly centered on the faint brown ring it had previously left on the Formica surface. The meticulous nature of the movement was not lost on Nat. It was a physical manifestation of absolute, unwavering control. The world outside was teetering on the edge of an abyss, drenched in kerosene, and Bumpy Johnson was organizing the table. "You did well, son," Bumpy said softly. "You kept your head. You brought the truth to the right door. Now, I need you to forget everything you saw. You go home. You lock your door. You do not look out the window tonight." "But, Mr. Johnson, the churches belong to God," Bumpy interrupted, his tone suddenly carrying the heavy finality of a judge's gavel. "But the pavement they sit on belongs to me. I will not let them burn." Nat swallowed heavily, nodding in silent, awestruck obedience. He slid out of the booth, slipping back into the damp, threatening night, leaving Bumpy alone once more. Bumpy sat in the silence for exactly 1 minute. He let the reality of the impending violence completely settle over him. The precinct captains, those arrogant men who sat behind polished oak desks and brass nameplates, believed they were playing high-stakes chess. They thought they had successfully backed him into a corner, forcing a bloody sacrifice. He stood up. The diner was still painfully quiet, the few remaining patrons stubbornly refusing to look in his direction, sensing the severe shift in the barometric pressure of the room. Bumpy walked slowly toward the dimly lit back hallway, where a heavy black rotary phone hung on the cracked plaster wall. He dropped a silver dime into the slot. The metallic clink was loud in the narrow space. He dialed 3 numbers and waited. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, it's me," Bumpy said softly into the heavy receiver. "Wake the boys up. No guns. No noise. Bring the heavy flashlights, the lead pipes, and nothing else. Meet me at the garage in 10 minutes. "There trouble, boss?" the voice asked, thick with sleep but instantly, sharply alert. "There's a fire trying to catch," Bumpy replied, his voice a low, chilling rumble that promised severe consequences. "We're going to steal their matches." He hung up the phone. The sharp click of the receiver breaking the connection sounded like the locking mechanism of a bank vault door. He walked back to the front of the diner, adjusting the lapels of his suit with practiced care. He placed his fedora squarely on his head, angling the brim slightly downward. He didn't rush. He didn't run. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked out into the Harlem night with the deliberate, measured stride of an emperor stepping onto a battlefield, ready to snuff out a holocaust with nothing but shadows, silence, and absolute authority. The garage on 142nd Street didn't look like a war room. It smelled of motor oil, oxidized rubber, and the damp, heavy scent of concrete. A single naked bulb hung from the rafters, swaying slightly in a draft that shouldn't have existed, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the hoods of 3 black Cadillacs. These cars weren't just transport. They were armored extensions of Bumpy's will. Bumpy stood by a heavy wooden workbench, his coat draped over a stool. He didn't look like a man facing a citywide catastrophe. He looked like a master tailor preparing to cut an expensive suit. On the bench lay a hand-drawn map of Harlem, the ink still fresh where he had circled 7 specific locations, the heartbeats of the community. 6 men stood in the semi-darkness. They were the old guard, men who didn't need to be told to be quiet. They understood that in Bumpy's world, volume was a sign of weakness. If you had to shout, you had already lost the room. They wore dark overcoats and flat caps, their faces obscured by the gloom, their hands steady. "They think they're hunting," Bumpy said, his voice low, resonating off the cinder-block walls. He didn't look up from the map. He traced a finger along Lenox Avenue. "The NYPD thinks they've found a way to make the tiger jump. They pour the gas, they light the match, and they wait for us to come out swinging, so they can put a bullet in our heads and call it keeping the peace." He looked up then, his eyes catching the light of the swaying bulb. There was no fear in them. There wasn't even anger. There was only a cold, analytical precision. "We aren't going to jump," Bumpy continued, "and we aren't going to swing. If a single shot is fired tonight, the commissioner wins. If a single drop of blood hits the pavement before the sun comes up, Harlem loses. We are going to be the water that puts out their fire before it even starts." He tapped the first circle on the map. Abyssinian Baptist. "Illinois," Bumpy said, addressing a man whose shoulders seemed to take up half the garage. "You take 3 men. You don't take heat. I want lead pipes and heavy flashlights. You get to Abyssinian. You don't park on the block. You walk in from the shadows. If you see a uniform with a jerry-can, you don't kill him. You don't even bruise him if you can help it. You stand in his way. You let him see you. You let him realize that the darkness he's using for cover belongs to us." Illinois nodded once. "A silent contract. Whisper." Bumpy turned to a smaller, wiry man who specialized in the unseen. "You take the 3 churches in the south. St. Philip's, Salem, and Mount Olivet. Same rules. You find the cops in the alleys. You don't provoke. You observe. If they tip the can, you step out. You tell them, policely, that the neighborhood is closed for maintenance. If they reach for their holsters, you make sure they see 10 of our brothers behind you. No words, just presence." The men absorbed the instructions. This was the Bumpy Johnson philosophy, power through restraint. The NYPD was expecting a street gang. Bumpy was deploying a ghost army. By refusing to play the role of the aggressor, he was stripping the police of their narrative. You can't claim self-defense against a man who is simply standing on a public sidewalk, watching you commit arson. "What about the evidence, boss?" Whisper asked, his voice a dry rasp. "The cans, the gas, they'll just take it with them." Bumpy pulled a small, silver Leica camera from his desk drawer. He set it on the map. "Every team takes a lens," Bumpy said. "I don't want them dead. I want them captured. I want photos of the badges. I want photos of the gas pouring onto the holy ground. We aren't fighting this in the gutters tonight. We're fighting this in the headlines tomorrow. The commissioner thinks he's an architect? Well, I've been building this city since before he learned how to shine his shoes." He checked his gold pocket watch. 2:15 a.m. The window was closing. The rogue units would be finishing their prep work, waiting for the coordinated signal to drop the matches. "They expect us to be loud," Bumpy said, putting his coat back on. The silk lining hissed against his shirt. "So we will be silent. They expect us to be violent. So we will be disciplined. Go. Protect the houses of the Lord. I'll be at the telephone. If anything moves that shouldn't, you let the air out of their tires and wait for my word." The men vanished into the night, the garage doors sliding shut with a heavy, final thud. Left alone, Bumpy walked back to the workbench. He picked up a pencil and began to write a list of names. Not names of street thugs or rivals, but names of journalists, civil rights leaders, and a few friends in the mayor's office who owed him favors that dated back to the Prohibition era. He knew the commissioner, a man named Murphy who walked with a cane and talked about cleaning up the filth, was likely sitting in a dark office downtown, waiting for the first report of smoke. Murphy was a man who believed in the absolute authority of the badge. He believed that the law was whatever he said it was. He viewed Harlem as a colony to be managed, not a community to be respected. Bumpy sat in the silence of the garage, the smell of gasoline from the map, the phantom scent of the threat, filling his nostrils. He thought about the churches. He thought about his mother's Sunday best. He thought about the dignity of a people who had nothing but their faith and each other. The NYPD wasn't just attacking him. They were attacking the social contract. In Bumpy's Harlem, you didn't touch the churches. You didn't touch the children. You didn't bring heat into the sanctuary. These were the unwritten laws that kept the chaos at bay. By breaking those laws, the police had surrendered their moral high ground. They had become the very filth they claimed to despise. He picked up the heavy black receiver of the garage's wall phone. He didn't dial yet. He just listened to the dial tone. A steady, unwavering hum. It sounded like the city breathing. "You're a predictable man, Murphy," Bumpy whispered to the empty room. "You think because I live in the shadows I don't understand the light. You're about to find out that the light is the brightest right before it burns you blind." He hung up. He walked to the back of the garage where a pristine 1963 Cadillac Fleetwood sat waiting. He got behind the wheel, the leather cool and firm beneath him. He didn't turn on the headlights. He rolled the car out into the alley, moving like a shark through deep water. As he drove through the darkened streets of Harlem, he saw his men. He saw the flicker of a cigarette in a doorway across from St. Jude's. He saw the silhouette of a hat on a rooftop overlooking Abyssinian. His network was active. The invisible fence was up. Every block he passed felt like a fuse that hadn't been lit. He passed a precinct car parked on a corner. The officers inside were looking away, studiously ignoring the alleys they were supposed to be patrolling. They were complicit in the silence. Bumpy slowed the Cadillac as he approached the final church on his list. He saw the black NYPD transport van idling in the shadows. He saw two men in civilian clothes, detectives, likely, sneaking toward the side entrance with heavy bags. He didn't stop. He didn't honk. He just drove past, his eyes locking for a split second with the driver of the van. Bumpy didn't scowl. He didn't threaten. He simply tipped his fedora. The driver of the van froze. The recognition was instant. The terror was palpable. In that one gesture, Bumpy had communicated everything. "I see you. I know what you're doing. And you are already dead in the eyes of the world." Bumpy turned the corner and pulled into a small, discreet parking lot behind a grocery store. He checked his watch again. 2:45 a.m. The inevitability phase of the night was beginning. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He began to cross-reference the timing. If the fires were set at 3 a.m., the first calls would hit the switchboard by 3:10. By 3:30, the sirens would be the only sound in Harlem. By 4 o'clock, the riots would start. "Not tonight," Bumpy murmured. He understood that his role tonight wasn't just a protector, but an architect of a different kind of reality. He was building a trap of his own, one made of truth, evidence, and the crushing weight of public shame. He wasn't going to fight the fire with water. He was going to fight it with the vacuum of the truth. The air in the car began to grow cold, but Bumpy didn't turn on the heater. He wanted to feel the chill. He wanted to stay sharp. He watched the rearview mirror, waiting for the first sign of his men returning. In the distance, a dog barked. A window slammed shut. Harlem held its breath. Bumpy Johnson leaned his head back against the seat, his eyes fixed on the dark spire of the church rising into the night sky. He looked like a man at prayer, but he was doing something much more dangerous. He was calculating the exact price of a commissioner's resignation. He wasn't thinking about the next hour. He was thinking about the next decade. He was thinking about the legacy of a man who saved his city from the people sworn to protect it. The first of his scouts appeared in the mirror, a shadow merging with a shadow. The report was coming. The match hadn't been struck yet, but the friction was building. "Let them pour," Bumpy whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The more they pour, the deeper they drown." The air in the alleyway behind St. Philip's Episcopal was thick enough to chew. It was 3:12 a.m., the dead point of the night where the city's heartbeat slows to a crawl, and the only things moving are those that shouldn't be. Detective Miller, a man whose career had been built on the sturdy foundation of just following orders, felt the cold sweat stinging his eyes. He gripped the handle of the 5-gallon jerry can. The metal was cold, vibrating slightly with the tremors in his hand. "Hurry it up," his partner, Vance, hissed from the mouth of the alley. Vance was looking at his watch, his silhouette jagged against the dim streetlights of 134th Street. "The signal is coming in 3 minutes. We need the soak to be deep. This wood is old. It'll go up like a Roman candle." Miller nodded, his jaw tight. He tipped the can. The glug-glug-glug of the kerosene was a rhythmic, sickening sound, splashing against the ornate side door where thousands of congregants had passed in search of peace. The smell was overwhelming now, sharp, chemical, and profoundly wrong. Just as Miller moved to the next window, the world changed. The silence didn't break. It deepened. From the absolute darkness of the church's recessed shadows, a figure stepped forward. Then another. Then 3 more. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They emerged like ghosts materializing from the stone itself. Miller dropped the can. The heavy metal hit the pavement with a hollow, echoing thud, splashing the remaining fuel across his own boots. He reached for the service revolver at his hip, his fingers fumbling with the leather strap of the holster. "I wouldn't," a voice said. It was Illinois. He stood 6'4", a mountain of a man in a charcoal overcoat that made him look like a piece of the architecture. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a 3-foot length of galvanized steel pipe, tapping it rhythmically against his open palm. Tap, tap, tap. "This is police business. Back off," Vance shouted from the alley entrance, though his voice lacked the authority of his badge. He had his own snub-nose .38 out, but it was shaking. He realized, with a sudden, sinking dread, that he wasn't just looking at Illinois. Behind the big man, 5 other figures had stepped into the light. They were Harlem men, deacons, numbers runners, shop owners. They were the neighborhood, and their faces were masks of cold, lethal judgment. "You're on holy ground, officer," Illinois said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't move toward them. He just stood there, an immovable object. "And you're carrying a lot of sin in those cans." Similar scenes were playing out simultaneously across the 6 other targeted sites. At Salem Methodist, a young detective found himself surrounded by 4 men who simply sat on the hoods of their cars, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The message was written in the calculated stillness of their posture. "We see you. We know what you are doing, and you aren't leaving until we say so." At Abyssinian, Whisper and his crew had been even more surgical. When the plainclothes team arrived, they found the back alley illuminated by the high-intensity beams of 4 industrial flashlights. The light was blinding, pinning the officers against the church wall like insects under a microscope. "Smile for the birdie," Whisper had joked, though his eyes remained as cold as a winter morning. In the center of the glare stood a man with a Leica camera. Click, whir, click. The flashbulbs popped, searing the images of the officers, the gas cans, and the unmarked police van into silver nitrate. The officers shielded their eyes, their faces contorted in a mix of rage and panicked realization. The darkness they had counted on to hide their crimes had been stripped away, replaced by the clinical, unforgiving light of evidence. Back in his Cadillac, parked 2 blocks from the precinct, Bumpy Johnson listened to the night. He didn't have a radio. He didn't need one. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The tension hadn't broken into the chaotic release of a riot. It had been coiled tighter, redirected into a localized, controlled pressure. He looked at his watch. 3:20 a.m. By now, the frustration in the police command centers downtown must have been reaching a fever pitch. The fire reports weren't coming in. The street war they had choreographed was failing to launch. Instead of reports of smoke, they were likely receiving frantic, whispered calls from their men in the field. Calls about shadows that wouldn't move and cameras that wouldn't stop clicking. Bumpy pulled a silver flask from his pocket, took a small sip of water, and wiped his mouth with a silk handkerchief. He thought about the men in those alleys. He knew the temptation for his boys to crack those officers' skulls was immense. He knew the history of every bruise and every insult those men had suffered at the hands of the NYPD. But he had given the order restraint. Restraint was the ultimate display of power. It told the enemy, I can destroy you, but I choose to dismantle you instead. In the alley at St. Philip's, Miller was hyperventilating. The smell of the kerosene on his boots was a death sentence. If he lit that match now, he'd go up with the building. If he didn't, he'd have to explain to the commissioner why the mission failed. Pick it up, Illinois said, gesturing to the dropped jerry can. What? Miller stammered. The can. Pick it up. And the cap. We don't like litter in this neighborhood. Illinois stepped forward, one heavy step that seemed to vibrate the ground. Then you're going to get in that van, and you're going to drive back to your hole. And you're going to pray, since you're so close to a church, that Mr. Johnson feels like being merciful tomorrow. Vance, still holding his gun at the alley's mouth, looked around. More men were appearing on the fire escapes above him. They weren't armed with rifles. They were armed with silence. It was the silence of a community that had decided the law no longer resided in a precinct, but in the collective will of the people who walked the pavement. We can't just leave, Vance hissed to Miller. We have orders. Your orders expired the minute you touched that gas, Illinois replied. He looked past them, toward the street where a black Cadillac had just slowly rolled into view. It didn't stop. It just cruised past, the rear window rolling down just enough for a single gloved hand to tap the side of the door twice. The signal. Go, Illinois commanded. The two officers, broken by the sheer psychological weight of the encounter, scrambled. They grabbed their equipment like panic thieves caught in the act. They piled into the unmarked van, the tires screeching as they fled the scene. They didn't look back. They didn't see Illinois pull a clean rag from his pocket and begin to wipe the kerosene from the church's stone foundation with the reverence of a high priest cleaning an altar. By 3:45 a.m., all 7 teams had retreated. Not a single match had been struck. Not a single church had been scorched. The NYPD's grand conspiracy had been smothered in the cradle by a man who understood that you don't fight a fire by becoming a flame. You fight it by taking away the oxygen. Bumpy sat in his car, watching the sun begin to gray the edges of the horizon. The danger was far from over. The officers would report back. The commissioner would scramble to cover his tracks. The state would try to turn the narrative, to claim that Bumpy's men had intimidated officers on patrol. But Bumpy had the film. He had the witnesses. And most importantly, he had the moral high ground, a territory the NYPD had vacated hours ago. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, a smooth, expensive purr. Now, Bumpy whispered to the empty car. We go to the theater. He drove toward a small, nondescript photo lab in the basement of a Harlem brownstone. The man waiting there would work through the dawn, developing the images that would change the history of the city. Bumpy felt the weight of the night lifting, replaced by the cold, exhilarating clarity of the endgame. The police had tried to burn the community to frame the king. Now, the king was going to use the truth to burn the commission. As he drove, he passed Abyssinian one last time. The stone was damp, the scent of kerosene lingering but fading. He saw a single light in the pastor's study. The sanctuary was safe. The legacy was intact. The pride of Harlem was unbroken. Bumpy Johnson adjusted his fedora, his face a mask of granite. The street war was over. The execution was about to begin. By 4:30 a.m., The predatory silence of the night had shifted into a cold, clinical industrialism. Inside the basement of a nondescript brownstone on 138th Street, the air was thick with the acidic, vinegary bite of developer chemicals and stop bath. This was the darkroom, a place usually reserved for documenting the more lucrative aspects of Bumpy's business, but tonight, it had become the forge where the NYPD's downfall was being hammered into shape. Bumpy stood in the corner, his presence looming even in the cramped, red-lit space. The crimson glow caught the sharp bridge of his nose and the hard, uncompromising line of his jaw. He looked like a figure from an old master's painting, one rendered in blood and shadow. He watched as a man named Silas, a photographer who had seen too much and said too little for 30 years, moved with surgical precision between the chemical trays. Silas used a pair of stainless steel tongs to lift a sheet of photographic paper from the fixer. He held it up to the red light. "Here's the first one, Mr. Johnson," Silas whispered. His voice hushed as if he were in a library. Bumpy stepped closer. The image was sharp. It showed Detective Miller, his face twisted in a mask of guilty terror, caught in the act of tipping a metal jerrycan against the rear door of St. Philip's. The badge on his belt, though partially obscured by his coat, caught the flash just enough to be unmistakable. It wasn't just a photo. It was a confession in black and white. "The next one is even better," Silas murmured, moving to the second tray. "We got the van's license plate, and this one here, that's Sergeant Vance. He's looking right into the lens. He looks like he's seen a ghost." Bumpy looked at the images as they were hung on a wire to dry, dripping like wet laundry. One by one, the faces of the conspirators emerged from the chemical fog. 7 churches, 7 sets of detectives, 7 instances of state-sponsored arson thwarted by a man the state called a criminal. "Make 3 sets," Bumpy ordered. His voice was flat, carrying no hint of the triumph he must have felt. "1 for the vault, 1 for the district attorney's front porch, and the third, that one goes to the newsroom at the Herald." "The Herald, sir?" Silas paused, the tongs hovering over the tray. "They aren't exactly friends of the neighborhood." "I don't need friends," Bumpy said, lighting a cigarette, the smoke curling red in the safety light. "I need a shark, and the Herald hasn't had a lead story this juicy since the end of the war. They'll eat the commissioner alive just to sell the morning edition." Bumpy understood the mechanics of power better than the men who held the titles. Power wasn't just about having the most guns or the most money. It was about the control of the narrative. If he had killed those officers in the alley, he would have been the villain, the Negro mobster who murdered brave policemen. But by letting them live, by capturing their shame on film, he had flipped the script. He was no longer the predator. He was the protector. The NYPD was no longer the law. They were the outlaws. He left the basement as the first hints of blue began to bleed into the eastern sky. The morning was coming, and with it, the inevitable response from downtown. Commissioner Murphy wouldn't just roll over. A man like that, a man who had built his career on law and order, would double down. He would try to strike first. Bumpy returned to his primary residence, a dignified apartment that spoke of old-world class rather than new-world flash. He sat at a heavy mahogany desk, the wood polished to a mirror shine. Before him lay a list of names. He picked up the phone and began to make calls. He didn't call his enforcers. He called the community. He called Reverend Clayton at Abyssinian. He called the head of the local barbers' union. He called the mothers who ran the neighborhood watch. To each, he spoke with the same calm, authority-driven tone. He didn't tell them everything, but he told them enough. He told them that the police had tried to harm the sanctuaries. He told them that the danger had passed, but the accountability was just beginning. "Stay off the streets today," Bumpy told the Reverend. "Keep the doors open. Let the people pray, but tell them to remain calm. I am handling the matter with the city. There will be no riots. There will be no fires. There will only be the truth." By 8 a.m., Harlem was awake, but it was a strange, subdued awakening. Usually, the morning air was filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation. Today, there was a heavy, expectant hum. People spoke in low tones on their stoops. They looked at the police cruisers that prowled the avenues with a new kind of gaze. Not fear, but a cold, knowing contempt. The word had spread, as Bumpy knew it would. Not through the newspapers yet, but through the Harlem grapevine, a communication network more efficient than any telegraph. The people knew that something had happened in the dark. They knew the king had stood guard while they slept. At 9:30 a.m., Bumpy's phone rang. It wasn't one of his men. It was a direct line from the commissioner's office. Johnson. The voice on the other end was gruff, strained, and vibrating with a suppressed fury. It was Commissioner Murphy. "Commissioner," Bumpy replied, leaning back in his chair, his feet crossed at the ankles. "You're up early. I imagine you didn't get much sleep last night." "I know I didn't. Too much activity in the alleys." There was a long, pregnant silence on the line. Bumpy could almost hear Murphy's teeth grinding. "I don't know what you think you have, Johnson," Murphy spat. "But if you think you can intimidate the NYPD, you've got a short memory. I'll have 100 men at your door by noon." "You could do that," Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a smooth, terrifying purr. But then, who would be left at the precinct to explain why Sergeant Vance and Detective Miller were carrying 5-gallon cans of kerosene into St. Philip's at 3 in the morning? Who's going to explain the photographs, Commissioner? The ones that are, at this very moment, being hand-delivered to the governor's office and the New York Herald. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of anger. It was the silence of a man who had just felt the trapdoor drop beneath his feet. "You're bluffing?" Murphy whispered, though the conviction was gone. "I don't bluff, Michael. I calculate," Bumpy said. "I have the film. I have the cans. And I have 40 witnesses who saw your boys trying to burn the house of God. Now, you have two choices. You can send those 100 men to my door and watch this city burn when the first edition of the Herald hits the stands. Or you can do the honorable thing. What do you want?" "I want what's best for Harlem," Bumpy said, and he meant it. To Bumpy, Harlem was his legacy, his child, and his fortress. "I want a public statement. I want you to tell the people that there was a misunderstanding. And then, I want you to get on that television program this afternoon, the one where you usually brag about your arrest records, and I want you to tell the world that you're tired, that it's time for you to move on." "You're asking me to resign? On live television?" "I'm not asking, Commissioner. I'm giving you a way to stay out of a prison cell. Because if those photos go public before you quit, not even the mayor can save you. Arson of a religious institution is a very serious charge, especially when it's caught on a Leica." Bumpy hung up without waiting for a reply. He knew the man would fold. Murphy was a creature of the institution, and the institution's first rule was self-preservation. Bumpy stood up and walked to the window. Below, on the street, he saw a group of young boys playing stickball. They were laughing, oblivious to the fact that their world had almost ended in flames just hours prior. He watched them for a long time, his face softening just a fraction. He had spent his life in the shadows, doing things that would keep him from ever being called a good man. But tonight, he had done something that few good men had the stomach for. He had protected the faith of his people by outmaneuvering the devil. He checked his watch. 11 a.m. The gears were turning. The couriers were moving. The photographs were being unsealed in offices across the city. Bumpy walked to his closet and selected a fresh tie, a deep, royal purple. He tied it with a perfect Windsor knot. He put on his coat and his hat. He had one more stop to make before the afternoon broadcast. He needed to visit the churches. He spent the next 2 hours being driven from site to site. He didn't go inside. He didn't seek out the pastors for a pat on the back. He simply had his driver pull the Cadillac to the curb. He would look at the stone, at the stained glass, at the ground where the kerosene had been poured. He would see his men, still stationed nearby, blending into the scenery but vigilant. At each stop, the result was the same. The community was holding. The loyalty was absolute. The legacy was secure. As he pulled away from the final church, Salem Methodist, he saw a small pile of discarded jerry cans on the corner, stripped of their contents and crushed flat. They looked like the discarded shells of some prehistoric beast. Bumpy smiled. It was the only trophy he needed. "Back to the office," Bumpy told his driver. "And turn on the radio. I want to hear the music before the news starts." He leaned back and closed his eyes. The scent of kerosene was gone, replaced by the faint, clean smell of the leather seats and the crisp October air. He had moved the pieces. He had set the board. Now all that was left was to watch the king fall. He wasn't thinking about the commissioner anymore. He was thinking about Sunday morning. He was thinking about the sound of the choir at Abyssinian, rising up through a roof that was still there, singing to a God that Bumpy Johnson had, in his own way, defended. The broadcast was in 3 hours. The city didn't know it yet, but the throne was about to be vacated. And Bumpy Johnson, the man the law called a criminal, was the only one who knew who was really in charge. The afternoon sun of October 14th hit the pavement of Harlem with a deceptive warmth. But inside the executive offices of the WNBC studios in Midtown, the atmosphere was glacial. The studio was a cavern of artificial light, thick black cables snaking across the floor like sleeping pythons, and the rhythmic, frantic clicking of teletype machines echoing from the newsroom next door. In the center of the set sat a mahogany desk, polished to a high-gloss finish that reflected the overhead stage lights. Behind it sat Police Commissioner Michael Murphy. He looked 20 years older than he had on the morning news. His tie was slightly askew, and the skin beneath his eyes was a bruised, watery gray. He kept touching the manila envelope that sat just out of frame, the envelope containing the Leica proof that Bumpy Johnson had ensured reached the right hands only 90 minutes prior. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson was not in the studio. He was exactly where he needed to be. The back room of the Celebrity, a quiet, upscale lounge on 125th Street. The room was dim, smelling of expensive bourbon and floor wax. A large, wooden cabinet television set sat in the corner, its screen flickering with the gray-white static of a station preparing to go live. Bumpy sat in a high-backed leather chair, his hands folded over the head of a silver-topped cane. He didn't have a drink. He didn't have a cigarette. He sat with the terrifying stillness of a spider who had already felt the vibration of the fly in the outermost ring of the web. Around him, the old guard stood in silence, Illinois, Whisper, and a few others. They didn't speak. They didn't cheer. They watched the screen with the same professional detachment as their boss. 10 seconds. A voice on the television whispered, "A floor manager's countdown." The NBC peacock flashed on the screen, followed by the special news bulletin graphic. The music was urgent, brassy, and authoritative. Then the camera cut to Murphy. The commissioner didn't look at the lens immediately. He looked down at his notes, his hands trembling just enough to make the paper rustle into his lapel microphone. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "People of New York," Murphy began, his voice cracking before he cleared his throat and tried again. "I have spent 30 years in the service of this department. I have seen this city at its best, and I have seen it at its most troubled." In the lounge, Whisper leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Bumpy remained a statue. "Last night," Murphy continued, "certain operations were initiated in the northern Manhattan sector. These were intended to be preventative measures during a time of heightened social tension. However," he paused, his gaze flickering toward the side of the stage, where a man in a sharp charcoal suit, one of Bumpy's legal conduits, stood watching from the shadows of the studio wing. "However, it has come to my attention that the execution of these orders was handled with a lack of judgment that I cannot, in good conscience, overlook." "He's choking on it?" Illinois whispered. "Hush," Bumpy said. A single word, but it silenced the room completely. On the screen, Murphy's face was slick with sweat. He knew that in newsrooms across the city, the Leica proof was already being laid out for the evening editions. He knew that if he didn't follow Bumpy's script to the letter, those photos of his men dousing churches in gasoline would be the first thing the public saw. He was a man performing his own execution to avoid a slow torture. "The integrity of the New York City Police Department is paramount," Murphy droned, his voice losing its strength. The sanctity of our community's institutions, including its houses of worship, must be held above all else. Because of the irregularities of last night's patrols, and because the ultimate responsibility for the conduct of my officers rests with me. He reached for a glass of water, his hand shaking so violently that the ice clinked against the glass. He didn't drink. He set it back down. I am announcing my immediate resignation as police commissioner of the city of New York, Murphy said. The studio erupted in a muffled chaos of camera flashes and shouted questions from the few reporters allowed in the gallery. Murphy didn't answer them. He looked directly into the camera then, not with authority, but with a hollow, haunted realization. For a split second, it felt as though he were looking through the television screen, through the miles of wire and concrete, directly into the dim lounge on 125th Street. He was looking at Bumpy. "I wish the city well," Murphy whispered. The screen cut to a commercial for a brand of laundry detergent. The bright colors and cheerful jingle a jarring, surreal contrast to the career that had just been incinerated on live air. In the lounge, the silence stretched for a long, heavy minute. No one moved. No one spoke. The gravity of the moment sat in the room like a physical weight. The head of the most powerful police force in the world had just been unseated, not by a bullet, but by a bookmaker from Harlem who understood the value of a sanctuary. Bumpy stood up slowly. He adjusted his jacket, pulling the sleeves down so exactly half an inch of white linen cuff showed. He didn't smile. A smile would have been a sign of surprise, and Bumpy Johnson was never surprised by the results of his own handiwork. "Illinois," Bumpy said, his voice as calm as if he were ordering breakfast. "Yes, boss. Call the Reverend at Abyssinian. Tell him the air is clear. Tell him the city is under new management." "Right away, boss." Bumpy turned toward the door, his cane clicking rhythmically against the checkered tile floor. As he reached the exit, he paused and looked back at the television, which was now showing a local news anchor frantically trying to make sense of the resignation. "You know the difference between a king and a pawn, Whisper?" Bumpy asked, not looking at him. "What's that, Mr. Johnson?" "A pawn moves because he's told to. A king moves because the board requires it." Bumpy stepped out onto the sidewalk of 125th Street. The news hadn't fully hit the pavement yet, but the energy was different. The heavy, oppressive tension of the morning had vanished, replaced by a strange, soaring lightness. He walked toward his Cadillac, which sat idling at the curb. Men on the corner tipped their hats as he passed. Women in Sunday dresses, even on a Wednesday, nodded to him with a deep, silent respect. They didn't know the specifics of the Leica cameras or the midnight standoffs in the alleys, but they knew that the king of Harlem had been busy while they slept. They knew the churches were still standing. Bumpy got into the back seat of the Fleetwood. He looked out the window as the car began to move, gliding through the heart of his empire. He saw the police precincts, where the officers were now huddled in confusion, their leadership gone, their burn order a terminal secret they would have to carry to their graves. He had achieved the impossible. He had used the enemy's own corruption as the fuel for their destruction. He had protected the faith of his people and, in doing so, had written a chapter of his legacy that could never be erased by a prosecutor's file or a rival's gun. As the car turned onto Lenox Avenue, Bumpy pulled a cigar from a silver case. He snipped the end with a small, sharp cutter. He struck a match, the only match that would be lit in relation to the events of the last 24 hours. He lit the cigar, the blue-gray smoke filling the cabin. The commissioner was gone. The churches were safe. The power was absolute. "Drive slow," Bumpy told the driver. "I want to see the sunset over the park." The Cadillac rolled on, a silent, black shadow in a city that was finally beginning to breathe again. The battle was over, and the king was still on his throne. The Sunday morning that followed the commissioner's fall was unlike any other in the history of Harlem. The sky was a pale, polished blue, and the air held a crispness that made the lungs feel clean. It was the first time in a week that the neighborhood didn't taste of invisible smoke and cold kerosene. On 138th Street, the doors of Abyssinian Baptist were thrown wide, the heavy oak portals welcoming a tide of congregants dressed in their absolute finest, furs, sharp wool overcoats, and hats that were architectural marvels of felt and feathers. A block away, perched in the back of his Fleetwood, Bumpy Johnson watched the procession. He didn't join the line. He knew his place was not among the saints, but at the gate, ensuring no demons found their way in. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the morning sun. "Look at them, Illinois," Bumpy murmured. Illinois, standing by the driver's side door, looked at the crowd. For the first time in years, the big man's face wasn't set in a grimace of tactical calculation. He looked almost at peace. "They're walking tall today, boss. Taller than usual. Because they know the walls didn't fall," Bumpy said. "A man can lose his money, his house, even his health. But you take away his sanctuary, you take away his soul. The NYPD forgot that. They thought they were playing with fire. They didn't realize they were playing with the only thing that makes these people feel like they're part of something bigger than a slum." The legacy of that night was already beginning to solidify into the bedrock of Harlem lore. In the barbershops and beauty parlors, the story was being told, not of a mobster protecting his turf, but of a shadow guardian who had turned the state's own weapons against them. The Leica photos had done more than force a resignation. They had stripped the mask off the city's power structure. The new acting commissioner had spent his first 48 hours in office issuing apologies and reassigning every officer whose face had appeared in Silas's darkroom. But for Bumpy, the victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the continuity of the community. He watched a young mother lead her 2 children toward the church steps. They walked over the very spot where, 3 nights prior, a detective had been poised to erase their world. There was no soot, no charred wood. The stone was clean. "The state thinks power is the badge," Bumpy said, his voice dropping into that low, authority-driven rumble. "They think it's the gun and the gavel. But true power is loyalty. It's knowing that when the sun goes down, there is a man in this city who will stand in the alleyway so the children can sing in the light. They'll call me a criminal in the history books, Illinois. Let them. As long as they have to print those books in a city that's still standing, I've won the argument." He signaled for Illinois to get back in the car. As the Cadillac pulled away, the first notes of the choir began to drift out from the church, a swell of harmony that seemed to vibrate the very asphalt beneath the tires. It was a sound of defiance, of survival, and of a peace that had been bought with silence and iron-willed restraint. Bumpy leaned back, the shadow of his fedora masking his eyes. He had survived the Italians, the feds, and the rogue elements of the precinct. He had seen empires rise and fall in the gutters of New York. But as he looked out at the vibrant, unbroken streets of Harlem, he knew this was his masterpiece. He hadn't just saved the buildings. He had preserved the dignity of the kingdom. The car turned onto 7th Avenue, heading toward the quiet, dignified office where the business of Harlem would continue. The commissioner was a footnote now. The match had been struck, but the fire had been Bumpy's to command. "Drive on," Bumpy said, the ghost of a smile finally touching his lips as the music faded into the distance. "We've got work to do."